two of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East, Turkey and Israel, and this week, open accusations flying between them. This is a Syrian airbase before and after it was bombed by Israel. You can clearly see the craters where the runway and hangars were hit in 8 separate strikes. Israel says it was stopping a Turkish military deployment before it happened. Syria says the base was empty and still under repair, not operational. While Turkey has labelled Israel's reasoning, quote, untenable, and accused Jerusalem of fabricating a reason to attack. Still with me? The reason we're talking about this, the bombing I mentioned before, is that it happened in northwest Syria at Abu al-Dahur airbase near Aleppo, near the Turkish border, which is relevant. Turkey is deepening its support for post-Assad Syria and is backing the new government with troops and training. At the same time, Israel says it's seeking to prevent new security threats from emerging on its border and is establishing its own presence in the south of the country. The risk of miscalculation is growing. So could Syria become the latest flashpoint in the Middle East? Joining me to unpack this developing story and what it means for the future of the Middle East is Asli Aydintasbas. She specialises in Turkish foreign policy and regional geopolitics in the Middle East at the Brookings Institute in DC. Welcome.
Hi, Shannon.
What is it that makes this airbase so important to Turkey and to Israel?
Shannon, this was quite a remarkable event and a dangerous one. This is the first time that Israeli planes, fighter jets, came so close to the Turkish border. At a base, a military base, an airstrip essentially, that Turkey had been rebuilding. And there have been rumors, unconfirmed, that there has been a Turkish military delegation visiting this site. A similar incident happened in April, further south, last year in April, near Palmyra, in which a base that Turks had been thinking of establishing was bombed a day after a Turkish delegation left. But in this instance, it is very close to the Turkish border. So it's a new level in the rivalry between Turkey and Israel. They are getting dangerously close to a situation which may transition from a regional rivalry into direct enmity. And I think that Israel is clearly trying to draw red lines. They do not want Turkey to establish bases in Syria, even if it is being asked by the new Syrian government for training or for bases. And on the other hand, Turkey is determined to expand its military footprint in Syria.
Okay, that ties in then, because I wanted to ask you, why is it that Israel feels particularly threatened by the Turkish troops? Is it that they could be improving, expanding that base, or would they have been potentially training Syrian forces there? What's the threat?
Well, Israel's vision about Syria is they're not happy with the government of Ahmed al-Sharaa. They don't want a strong, unified, centralized government in Syria. Turkey's vision for Syria is the opposite. They are very happy with Ahmed al-Sharaa and the overthrow of the Assad regime. They see it as an opportunity. They know the incoming crowd, but more importantly, they're very determined to help him militarily and economically in every other way to make sure that Syria remains centralized and unified. But there's more than that. I think Turkey and Israel are going through this unique moment psychologically and strategically in their history, in which they see each other as the topmost threat. Turkey is seen in Israel as a country that's expanding its influence. There are people in Israel who think it's as dangerous as Iran, more dangerous than Iran. There's resentment about Turkish support for Gaza and Hamas. There's a flip side of this coin in Turkey. In Turkey, Israel is seen as a country that is bent on expanding, that greater Israel idea is happening, and that Israel is spending all its energy on trying to contain Turkey in Eastern Mediterranean, in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere. So I think the strategic culture between these two countries, which used to be allies only a decade ago, 2 decades ago, the strategic culture has now changed. They see each other as utmost threat. The irony is, of course, as you have said in your opening statement, they're not just the two of the strongest militaries in the Middle East, but they're also America's closest allies. Let's add to that Turkey is a NATO member state, and Israel is a very close US ally.
Indeed, and we will get to those relationships a little bit later, but let's just stick to Israel first and take a listen to what Netanyahu had to say about this incident.
We will not tolerate a Turkish military presence establishing itself as it moves south. It threatens us, and we conveyed that clearly. Now, we saw that Turkey intends to establish a presence in the airport, south of its lines and close to Aleppo. So we conveyed a message. The message got through, but it seems they didn't listen. And so we made sure that they will understand it better.
So how do you interpret what Netanyahu said when he says they went to send a message to Turkey and they didn't listen? So they had to do what they had to do. How do you interpret that?
Well, this, Shannon, is very threatening language. And now your listeners have an understanding of how President Erdogan reacts to these instances. He's not someone who pulls his punches. He's not someone who minces his words. So I think this language coming out of Netanyahu, we're not going to allow them to have any presence in Syria, any military presence, is of course something that Turks are not happy with. But Erdogan has not responded yet. Turkish government has been uncharacteristically, I say uncharacteristically because we know the kind of spats there have been with Europe. But in this instance, they have been uncharacteristically quiet about it, waving it away as electoral politics in Israel. Of course, Netanyahu is going for an election in October, and Turkey seems to be an evergreen topic. There seems to be a lot of emphasis on Turkey. After Netanyahu's speech, other ministers have come out and said they're not going to let this happen and let that happen. And there have been posters that went up in Israel, posters depicting Erdogan alongside Mujtaba Khamenei, Iran's new religious leader, as well as Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah leader, and Zohran Mamdani, the mayor of New York. So obviously, Netanyahu has done this in previous elections. You know, he likes to talk about a threat inflation, and they're all coming to get us. They're all united. What was interesting to me in this instance is that Turks have been more cautious, more quiet. Erdogan had a phone conversation with Trump. My understanding is that U.S. president is asking Turkey not to react too much, not to overreact. And so they're writing this off as electoral politics. But this does not change the overall dynamic.
So just to bring our viewers up to speed, you said Erdogan hasn't responded, but we do have a response from one Turkish official. So let's just take a listen.
Israel continues its attacks and military activities in southern Lebanon despite the framework agreement that was signed. And with its recent attacks on Syria, it is also targeting that country's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and unity. No allowance should be made for the perception that Israel's military interventions against neighboring countries are normal and acceptable.
So let's look back in the past couple of years to just try and get a bit of context around this as well. Of course, Israel has struck Syria before, repeatedly, hundreds of times since Assad's fall in December 2024. It says that that was to prevent weapons and capabilities from falling into the wrong hands. Does the Abu al-Dahur airbase fit the same doctrine?
It doesn't. There was a deconfliction agreement, an undeclared agreement between Turkey and Israel through CENTCOM and Azerbaijan. It's sort of the deconfliction channel was loosely dividing up Syria into two zones of influence. The south, all the way up to Damascus and a little bit north is Israel's, where they have air superiority. They control the skies. But it was understood that the north was a territory close to Turkey. Turkey already has a number of bases there, and that they would continue to train Syrian military, the new Syrian military, something that the Trump administration also understands and looks upon favorably. This new incident seems to suggest that that deal, which Turkey and Israel reached via CENTCOM, is no longer there. So all bets are off.
But we haven't talked so much actually about Syria itself, of course, where this attack took place. Al-Sharaa, the former al-Qaeda-linked commander, is now the Syrian president. Who does he need more, Turkey or Israel?
He's been a very interesting figure, doing his own balancing act. He obviously has been very close to Turkey, back from the time he was actually holed up in Idlib, an opposition stronghold under Turkey's protection. That is how the group was able to survive, his group. So there is a very close relationship there, not just with him, but with his ruling cadres, including, of course, Foreign Minister Shabani. Most of them are Turkish speakers. They all know Turkey. They've had families in Turkey, and they relied on Turkey during the time when Assad was in power. But Sharaa is an interesting figure. He wanted to balance off the relationship with Turkey with increasingly closer ties with the United States. And of course, we know how that President Trump is fond of him. He's praised him a number of times. He's sent him perfumes. He said he's good looking. He said he's doing really a good job. He repeats that very often. And also with Saudi Arabia. Sharaa has developed relations with Saudi Arabia. To me, I think that is an indication that he does not want two things. One, he doesn't want to be just Turkey's guy. He doesn't want to have to rely on Turkey solely. And secondly, he doesn't want to be caught in a crossfire between Turkey and Israel, which is why today we heard the news of a phone call between I believe Mossad chief and and Syrian foreign minister reaching out. The two countries, Israel and Syria, have talked about signing a security agreement. They would need to at some point. The United States is also pushing for this. It's very hard for al-Sharaa or any other Syrian leader to sign a security agreement so long as Israel continues to occupy part of southern Syria, which it has since the downfall of the Assad regime. But there is a channel of communication there and an effort, I think, on the part of Syrians not to get caught in between these two strong countries.
Yeah, and al-Sharaa has spoken about it multiple times, trying to make sure that weapons are not getting to Hezbollah through Syria because he didn't want to inflame any tensions already. But let's move on to the US now. As you've alluded to several times, they are, of course, the other big player in this relationship. And to get an impression of how the US is thinking about it, we do have a tweet from the ambassador actually to Turkey, and he's of course the special envoy to Syria as well. And he said, "We are deeply concerned that the confirmed Israeli airstrikes on Abu al-Dahur airbase constitute," and this is the important bit, "an unnecessary escalation that does not advance regional stability." That's quite strong wording from the US. What do you make of that response?
It's very strong wording. Tom Barrack is not just any ambassador. He's a very close friend of President Donald Trump. He also has a big portfolio. It's not just Turkey, where he's the ambassador. He's also pretty much in charge of Syria and now Iraq, dabbles in Lebanon and other issues too. So he's this Uber ambassador, to throw in a German word there. And I think that he's making himself very clear. United States, like Turkey, wants a unified Syria under al-Sharaa and does not want to see the kind of weakening or decentralization. Trump administration has recently withdrawn troops from Syria. The idea there and the calculus there is we pull out troops. We want to withdraw our forces in the region, so we rely on local partners. And they see al-Sharaa as a capable local partner backed by Turkey. That whole equation, Sharaa backed by Turkey, has been the reason Syrian Kurdish forces decided to actually sign an integration deal with the Sharaa government. That's the reason that U.S. policy is being pretty aligned with the Turkish policy. But in comes the Netanyahu administration. They are not necessarily on with this idea that Syria should be stronger and consolidated in Damascus. I think we've seen in the past, over this past year, closer relations with Druze and Kurdish communities. They definitely have publicly called for decentralization in Syria. And I think on top, instead of wanting to work with Sharaa to keep Iranian influence out, which has been the case in Syria before the downfall of the Assad regime, they seem to think that their priority is prevent the emergence of a strong regime under al-Sharaa in Syria. So this is going to be a very interesting thing to watch. We're also going to have to watch if the Israeli policy changes after the Israeli elections. Israeli national security community, I should say, seems to be divided on this issue. While the government is very anti-Sharaa, anti-Turkey, and sort of escalating, especially in an electoral cycle, some in Israel, within bureaucracy and national security circles in general, believe that there should be a de-escalation, that Sharaa might actually be a good partner for Israel. What's more important is to keep Iran out. So I think we're going to watch Israelis debate this out over the next couple of months, and definitely after the elections.
Indeed. So, Asli, do you see a real chance of direct confrontation between Turkey and Israel?
I do. I hate saying this, but I've been saying this for a year, and initially people were rolling their eyes, but you've just displayed the kind of reaction U.S. ambassador has had. And in other comments, what he said was, look, Turkey could have responded. And the reality is Turkey could have responded. It's likely that Israel has used F-35s, a fighter jet that Turkey does not have. And maybe they did not have enough time to respond. But in another incident, some other part of Syria or Eastern Mediterranean, you could think of a response or even an accident. So I do think this is a very serious situation.
Yeah, okay. And so this is obviously a developing story, and you are watching this very closely. For me and for everyone else watching, what is sort of one thing that we could be looking out for in the next couple of weeks that will kind of give us a hint as to whether the situation is de-escalating or getting worse?
I think it would be interesting to watch what Erdogan says. As I mentioned before, he's been uncharacteristically quiet, and I think he's doing that because of his relationship with Donald Trump, and he doesn't want to stir the pot more. If that continues, that's a good sign. Another thing to watch is whether or not Washington will be able to actually establish a deconfliction mechanism that the American ambassador has talked about. Turkey and Israel actually need a mechanism, a channel, a diplomacy, a process, whatever we call it. But these bureaucratic-led mechanisms have not been the Trump administration's strong suit. They like to do phone diplomacy, quick calls, leadership diplomacy, but they don't like to do processes. But this is one instance in which you actually do need a very serious institutionalized bureaucratic process. And maybe if Americans cannot do it, maybe the European Union can step in trying to help.
Well, I certainly will be watching with interest. Asli Aydintasbas with the Brookings Institute in DC. That's been very insightful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Shannon.
As Asli just said, the one thing to be watching is what that response will look like from the Turkish leader Erdogan. This could risk spilling over and really turning into the next conflict point in the Middle East. I will certainly be keeping track of this with interest, and you can too, across all of Deutsche Welle's programs. Thank you for joining us.